we're a Houston-based firm, and so this project was equally important to us. And my wife grew up in Webster, and so this was personal. You all are here, so I know many of you probably flew in. You can kind of see the location where we're located from downtown Houston. And this is an early image of the base when it was finished with some of the milestone dates. But obviously for this base, much of what was happening in Florida was moved here once the missions were launched. And we're going to talk a little bit about a particular building, a series of rooms in Building 30. And this is that room. That building is comprised of three components. There's an administration wing on the far right. There's a lobby, and then where the control rooms are located is this large windowless building. So this is a plan of the Apollo Mission Control Center. There's what we'll refer to the MOCR or MOCR 2, which is where the consoles are located that Jim mentioned earlier. There's also a viewing room, a sim control room, there's a rocal recovery room, and a summary display projection booth, which is known as the Bat Cave. And so the areas in blue are the areas that we were able to restore as part of the project. This is kind of an axiometric drawing, and Jim kind of showed a similar picture, but this, the Bat Cave was a rear projection room with the largest screens at the time, and this room created like home theater, was the inspiration for home theater that then was a big popular in the 70s. So in this room, there were many missions from Gemini, and then the Apollo missions were flown in this room. Again, it's the Mission Operation Control Room. It's number 2, so it's one on the 3rd floor. And Jim showed you a picture of Mission Operation Control Room 1, which is now FICR 1, which is the room below. That room has been gutted and for station. And so this is what the room looked like during Apollo 11. And we were part of a team working under Sandra to restore this room, which is totally gutted for the shuttle program, to be exactly as it was during the moon landing. These are just 2 pictures from different directions. Most pictures are taken from one corner of the room, and so you can't see other areas, but there was, as mentioned, there was a film that was found that allowed us to see a lot of things that had never been seen before, and we used to restore. This was the simulation control room, or called the sim room. This is where folks thought about ways the mission could fail, and they made a test, and if you passed the test, then they all had to buy everyone in the other room a case of beer. But if they failed the test, then they had to buy everyone in that room a case of beer. And this training is what part of the success of the program was, that they trained for failure. And so when something would happen, like being struck by lightning, they did a simulation for that. And when it happened, they already knew what to do. And so, you know, they kept learning and improving, and that's one of the ways they were successful. This is the ROCR, or the Recovery Control Room. This room no longer exists. It's now partially a storage room that's controlled by the Department of Defense. So we were not able to restore this room, but we did use this photograph to print it on the window into the room, which we'll show you. And this is the visitor viewing area, which was where the public would come to see what was happening in this room. This was much more open at the time. People could just drive up here and just come in the room and check it out. But you might find the Queen of England, you might find your senator, or just normal folks from the city would just come and see what was happening. And then there are 2 communication booths that flank that room, and then the Bat Cave. And so in the Bat Cave is where these really large IDA4 projectors were bouncing images. They generally face away from the screen, and there's a very large mirror that they hit the mirror and they bounce back onto the screen, because the focal length you needed was so great that they had to do this deflection with the mirrors because they didn't have the space for it. The room behind this room is where all the computers were at the time. That later became the red flight control room, or red FICR. Many of these things were saved from demolition by Sandra Tetley, who has a building on this base where over many years, and even before her time, things that came out of this room were put into a storage room with an agreement from the Texas Historical Commission. And that was the basis of much of what the restoration was based on, to put original artifacts from Apollo back in the room. And then the other story was that the first half of Shuttle was also controlled from this room as well. And at that time, the room was stripped. So the carpet was removed, the wallpaper was removed, the ceiling tiles were removed, the consoles were reconfigured, as Jim mentioned, for Shuttle. And but this is also part of its history, and as part of that history, the Shuttle plaques also were put on the wall along with Gemini and the Apollo. And as mentioned, after 1995, the room was decommissioned and open for tours. There was a very light attempt to restore the room, and this is what the restoration looked like. The consoles were put back in the Apollo 11 locations, but the consoles were still Shuttle configuration. There were no displays active on these consoles. This room was really built without any heating, because all the heat from the incandescent bulbs and all the projectors put off so much heat, they didn't have to heat the room itself at the time. And the images on the screens were not the actual images that you would have seen in this room. They weren't the size, they were just like a little slide projector, like a Kodak projector behind the screen. This is kind of the first time Jordan and I walked onto the floors. This is what we saw. This is from that visit. But people were doing tours, and even then, when we walked in the room, we were honored to be there because we knew, what had happened in this space and why it mattered. So we'll have another talk. Melanie's here to talk about how she conserved the original fabric on the seats. The seats and the carpet in this room were still original to the room. But things were really distressed, and there were open parties in this room. You could have pizza parties here. There was a space camp, and I think when Sandra walked in the room one time and there were kids, they were going over the consoles, racing over the consoles like a hill. And that's what set off alarm bells, and that's where she started working to try to save the space and give it the care and respect that it needed. Again, the wallpaper that wasn't original was also coming off. There was, again, a lot of different mission plaques from all the different missions. And so what happened was that Sandra got really upset, and she turned to the National Park Service and applied for a grant. They actually gave her more money than she asked for so they could do this historic furnishings report. And this was the basis of saving the room. This was done very early, and there was not a consensus on how to use this report, but this report established that the Apollo 11 was the time period, was the last missions were the most significant, significance for this room. Prior to this happening, though, the building itself did become a National Historic Landmark, and that sort of coincided with sort of the shuttle things that were happening. So there was an understanding that it was important, but at the same time, it was still being really destroyed by tours. Anyone could walk on the floor, and a lot of foot traffic on the carpet. So a lot of research started happening. We did a consultation with the flight control, Apollo flight control members, and so we see Ed Fendel on the right, we see Ed Fendel on the left, and Gene Kranz as well on the left. And so the other aspect of this project is it took some money to do this, and one of the main things that even people that wanted to restore the MOCR, no one wanted to use government funding that could be used for current or future missions to go toward restoring something old on this base. The funding today is not what it was in the 1960s, and so we needed to find partners. A big part of that came from the city of Webster, which adjoins this area, and it's the tours that come here really are what kind of pay a lot of the taxes for the city, and so they got together. Space Center Houston partnered with them. NASA joined in, the flight controllers, and a lot of folks that just like space and space history got involved, and the ACHP, and I'll talk about them in a second. Without the ACHP, the project never would have occurred, because in order to fund the project, we had to find outside money, and it turns out you can't give money to the government unless it's your taxes. That's the only legal method, is that I know you don't want to do it, but that's legal. But there was provision through the ACHP, it was a governmental agency, and basically there had been a provision that could donate money to this governmental group and they could give it toward a restoration, but only $200,000 had ever been used to use that mechanism. And that's how this project was funded, through all these outside donations. This is a team of just all the different firms that were involved. Our role in this project was, as Jim mentioned, they restored the consoles themselves. Everything in the room that you see, every surface, every object, every found cigarette butt, everything except the images on the screens, we were responsible to put a team together to replicate them authentically and prove it with photographs or video and drawings of that it would be accurate. And these are some of the drawings that were mentioned in the last lecture. Like, these drawings don't exist on this base. They existed in a library, because so much information, if they don't use it here, they get rid of it because they don't have space for just information. So a researcher found this in an archive and was the basis for much of our work. We also did consultations, again, with the flight controllers. So interviewing them, what did they do? Like, at every console, understanding what that flight controller was doing, what they were looking for. That helped inform the team. It helped inform how to restore the consoles themselves to make it authentic. And then a vast amount of work then took place to kind of document that process and then prescribe how to make the fix.
So before any restoration work could start, we had to, create the drawings and get approval from National Park Service and the Texas Historical Commission. So in the drawings, we called out the materials, we showed what interventions we were doing, and for instance, where if something was faulty, where we kind of are proposing to stabilize it as like this standing desk in the visitor viewing area. And then, which you'll see images coming up of how we staged the desks. We even kind of had to create drawings of that and again get approved by the departments. And then back up all of our proposed work with photographic evidence using videos that were provided and photos from the archives. And again, this is the back cave, and we were able to reuse these mirrors. So all the projections that you'll see in the upcoming images are still using the original Apollo mirrors. It's just new projectors. So that was a very kind of a neat opportunity. This is Yanni Langer. He's a kind of a forensic finish analysis, and he determined that some of the original paint stencils weren't, they had been repainted over time, so he uncovered it and he by hand repainted it back to what it looked like during the Apollo era, and then we did some color matching. This panel up here had never been painted during the shuttle, so we were able to color match that and bring all the paint back to Apollo era colors. There was around JSC, we did several trips walking through all the buildings around campus to find Apollo era artifacts. We found a few trash cans that we could document in the photos, photographic evidence, and we repainted them and placed them back in the restoration. And again, Yanni helped us kind of do some scratch testing to figure out what the original color was of that trash can. Here's Cosmosphere removing the consoles to take back to their office. And then there's P-tube stations at each row of consoles so they could communicate with different floors in the building and different offices. These are hard piped, and so these pipes had to be cut, but because they're hard piped, like this carpet that was underneath was from the Apollo era. So we were able to work with Mohawk. We gave them a piece of that carpet. They color matched the threads, and then barber poled it together. And then we selected from their line of products a pattern that was as close as we could get to the original woven fabric. And they created a custom broadloom run of carpet for us for this project. Again, this is after the consoles are removed, before restoration. In the photos, we noticed these additional air diffusers were added during Space Shuttle. They're not there. They weren't there during the Apollo era. There was mission plaques, so we filled those up, patched holes, removed all the non-original wallpaper, and then Melanie's team came and packaged up the seats to begin restoration. All of the ceiling tiles were removed for this project. They were put in during Space Shuttle when the sprinkler system was added. So we found an original carpet tile down on the first floor lobby in a phone booth. So what we did was we found a kind of a standard ceiling tile that didn't have any holes, and we tried to match the custom hole pattern. We asked the contractor to use a CNC machine and try and drill 8,000 square feet of ceiling tiles, and it was taking too long. So they created a custom kind of a punch, and they hand punched 8,000 square feet of ceiling tiles for us, and then reinstalled them. And then a few other, we were able to salvage some of these original smoke and heat detectors from other buildings around JSC. Oh, sure. Sorry, can you all hear me better now? Sorry about that. All of the mission plaques that were on the wall were removed and sent off for restoration or stabilization, and even the American flag, which has been to the moon and brought back, was packaged up and restored. The wallpaper, we identified the original wallpaper behind some of the equipment, also behind kind of fire extinguishers, and we left those in place once we reinstalled wallpaper to create little window panes. And one interesting, I was able to locate the original manufacturer the original manufacturer of the wallpaper was sold to another company. That company still had the original drum. So the wallpaper that we put back is from the same pattern drum. It has been retooled, so it's just the pattern's a little sharper, but this is a side-by-side between the original and the new wallpaper. And again, Melanie's team, which she'll discuss shortly, just wanted to show you this side-by-side image of how dirty the seats were before restoration and how clean she was able to get the fabric after. Our photos, we did some digging, and we found out that the original chairs in the room were steel case chairs. So we put out some calls around campus and through other organizations like Docomomo. And we were able to get 20 chairs, enough to put one in each console. And then also we were able to find an original steel case fabric chart and identify the original Seek fabric. And then working with a local loom, our weaver, she used her loom in her house and actually wove custom fabric for us that matches the original steel case fabric. And there she is right there. And then restored chairs. And then Sandra helped us put out a call from all the JSC employees to kind of go through their offices and help us collect all Apollo era artifacts, coat racks, hangers, binders, kind of those steel chairs, and additionally headsets. Every flight controller had headsets, so we needed to have those at each console. We also found a rusted out cigarette ashtray, which you may have seen in the photos you'll see, but working with Steve Pine and another gentleman, we were able to fully restore it. So one of the requests from Sandra and the flight controllers was to kind of leave the room as they would have left it, just as if they stood up from their consoles, left the room. So to make that look real, we had to stage the consoles with appropriate artifacts, again, that we found through research. So a lot of these cups, were ordered through eBay. We found this Regal Rocket coffee maker in its original box, again, through eBay. A lot of this stuff was recovered from JSC, again, from the donation. And then, of course, we had to put back cigar ashtrays, cigarette ashtrays, and then era-appropriate packaging. Another team did a great job of recreating all of the graphics, the movies, the slides, the films that are projected onto our screen. And then here's some images of the restored Batcave, again, taking advantage of those original mirrors, just with new projectors. And then we were able to bring in some of Sandra's artifacts and keep those in display. And then here's some few images of Cosmosphere bringing back the consoles using the Super Guppy, and just how happy the flight controllers are seeing the restored consoles. And here's an image of the restored carpet, and then us starting to stage it. And then the next few images are all restored images. Again, here's that cigarette lighter, the new projector, the new slides. All the consoles are staged. And then up along this wall over here, this is all the restored patches we brought back and put them in their appropriate place. New ceiling tiles, new lighting.
I might mention, these are the mission roses. There was an anonymous, donor every time there was a mission that would go to a local flower shop here in Webster, and these roses would be delivered. And so they were always in the room. Sometimes they were on the floor, according to Mr. Krantz. But in our photographs for what our project, they were in this location, so that's where you'll see them if you go on the tour. And my wife, who's from Webster, was able to go purchase these from the same flower shop. And we understand the original donors are no longer alive, but their family, who we think now live in Dallas, still send mission roses to this day. So another thing that was a challenge for us is that most of the pictures in this room were from the back of the room, so we couldn't see this side very well. There was a video that surfaced that helped us, and we knew there were these boxes full of binders that sat on these ledges that people would also sit on, but the ledge is not very wide, and every time you put a box, the box would fall over. And so we finally talked to one of the flight control directors who said, well, the boxes had a lid, and they would just push the lid down like a kickstand on your bike, and that held it up. And so we retrofit these lids with these hinges, and that solved the problem. So.
One area that we could no longer restore was the simulation control room. So that previous image, that historic image, we were able to actually print on the back of glass and then put it in the viewing window for that room to kind of honor those men that were in that room.
And also in this photograph, you can see at the end of the hallway, the one thing we did change was the shuttle plaques, which were not part of the Apollo. They weren't there in 1969, but they were part of this room. were moved to this part of the hallway so that if you went on a level 9 tour, you would walk by these shuttle plaques and be able to see those items.
Okay, I'll go real quick because I think we're out of time. But and then just an image of the viewing room, and then the side communication booth as part of that. We actually reconstructed that desk to match. And then here's a photo of the Apollo 11 landing team on the anniversary, the 50th anniversary, sitting at their consoles, which was neat. And again, the full white flight team and their families after restoration. Okay.
Good.